Hello, my name is David Schwartz, and I am the Vice Chair of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association. Thank you so much for participating in the 2022 24-hour Rule of Law Webathon. Our focus this year is on the intersection of the rule of law with economic and social development. The program you are about to watch, Rule of Law, Threats from Radicalization and Extremism, considers one such intersection. Unfortunately, there's a lot to talk about. Our moderator for this panel is Pedro Urdanito. Pedro is a corporate and M&A partner at the leading Venezuelan law firm Lega. He also serves as a law professor teaching comparative law in Caracas. Pedro, thank you for leading our discussion on this important topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone from wherever around the world you're watching. I'm excited. I'm filling in for my dear friend Santiago Concha. So please forgive any mishaps, any mistakes I may have in doing this. But I'm excited about moderating this panel. We have wonderful experts to talk about rule of law threats from radicalization and extremism. Today, we have 5 experts with very different experiences. I hope, and I'm sure you will enjoy very much what they have to say. We will be hearing from Stephen Hendricks, from Brené Doplik, from Gabriel Calleja, Leila Mooney, and Elisa Massimino from Georgetown. I will be introducing each one of them before they speak. Each one will give a short presentation of about 10 minutes, and that will be followed up by questions from you. And I will ask that everyone please use the chat function here on the Zoom so that I can then ask the specific question to each one of our panelists. I will begin by asking our dear friend Stephen Hendricks to give us, before he gives his remarks, and before I do the introduction, he will let us know the difference between radicalization and extremism and how it affects rule of law. Let me introduce Stephen. Stephen Hendricks serves as the senior advisor for USAID's programs in South America. Previously, he was deputy mission director for USAID in Ghana. He served as an interim mission director in Bolivia and for the Eastern Caribbean. He has held positions with USAID in Nigeria, Paraguay, Iraq, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and in USAID's Latin America and Caribbean Bureau. Before joining USAID, he was with the University of Wisconsin Land Tenure Center and the UW Law School Institute for Legal Studies. He was also a partner here in my home country in Venezuela with a law firm in the 80s and 90s. And he has been a counsel with the Export-Import Bank of the US. He was also an intern of the Wisconsin Supreme Court and a law clerk with the US Department of the Interior. Steve holds degrees from Carroll College in economics and Spanish, and from the University of Wisconsin, a JD and MA in Ibero-American Studies. He also got an LLD from Universidad Mayor de San Andrés and Universidad de Carlos, Guatemala, San Carlos in Guatemala, and SJD. And he also did a professional law course at the Ghana School of Law. I think Stephen's credentials are very, very long, so I think he's more than qualified to speak about this topic, and he's going to talk to us not only the introduction, but it's also going to refer to Nigeria specifically. So, Steve, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with the audience today. Thank you to the American Bar Association for extending this opportunity to me. I will be speaking in a personal capacity today, not as a professional of the U.S. government or any other institution. And let me just start out by saying, distinguishing a bit between radicalization and violent extremism. I think probably all the speakers today are going to be talking about one or the other, but the threats to rule of law and governance and democracy can manifest themselves in different ways. And one form is radicalization, and that might be a pushing of parties to the left extreme or to the right extreme because of breaches of rule of law or governance. And another form this might take is violent extremism. And I think what I would like to talk about now, just for the next 9 minutes or so, is Nigeria and looking at violent extremism as a function of the breach of rule of law. Nigeria, as some of you in the audience may know, has actually 3 major conflicts going on simultaneously. Any one of them would be the talk of a major think tank discussion between the Fulani herdsmen in the north, who are really victimized by climate change and urbanization and many other factors leading to conflict. Another is in the Delta, where we have unsettled issues going back to the 1967 to 1970 Biafra War, which left 2 million dead. But I want to talk about Boko Haram. Boko Haram's gone through a number of name changes, and they seem to change their name about every couple times a year. So let's just call it Boko Haram and keep it simple. Boko Haram is an incredibly deadly phenomenon. From 2010 to 2016, 20,000 Nigerians died. This is largely concentrated in the northeast of Nigeria, Borno State, Yobe, Adamawa, Gombe State. This probably wasn't really on a lot of people's radar screen until 2011, when there was a suicide attack on the UN, which blew up the front of the building. Many of you may know about the Chibok girls who were kidnapped at a Christian school in the Northeast. But eventually by 2015, this group, Boko Haram, controlled a self-described caliphate larger than Belgium, larger than the US state of West Virginia. Massive amount of area. About 6,000 people a year died. 3/4 of them were Muslim. And it was not just Northeast Nigeria. It also spanned Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. It was all in this area of the Lake Chad region. And Boko Haram as a force could hide really in the Sambisa forest, and where it could recharge batteries, train, and go out and fight, and then go out. Why was it located there? If you look at a map of Africa, you really have to pull out a map, and you look north-south from Lake Chad. You've got the guns coming down from the south. You got the spices going north towards the Middle East. It's on the Hajj route going to Mecca, east and west. And really, Lake Chad is almost the center of Africa. So you're really at a crossroads there, and you can control trade flows. And Boko Haram set up their own alternative rule of law system apart from the Nigerian government, which ran transactions in that area. How do we get to a situation this bad in such a country as rich as the country with the highest GDP in the continent? Well, if you go back and look at what was happening in Nigeria, I think you'll see under President Goodluck Jonathan in the 20-teens, soldiers often lacked food. Soldiers lacked bullets. Sometimes they weren't paid. School teachers went unpaid. Hospital workers went unpaid. Where did this money go? When the soldiers in the Northeast took matters into their own hands and caught the commander who was stealing the money that was supposed to go to their salary and detained him, what happened next was astonishing. The Nigerian armed forces liberated the commander and then held the soldiers who had detained the commander on criminal charges and gave them the death penalty. The commander who was stealing the money, he gets away scot-free. It has a silver lining. The sentences were commuted to 10 years each for the so-called mutineers. But you can see how it's unfathomable in a country as rich, a country as Nigeria, that you would have this problem in the Northeast. The central bank president actually produced a criminal report of billions with a B, billions of dollars stolen in Nigeria. And despite independence of the central bank, the president simply had him removed. That's how the allegations of corruption were dealt with. For those of you following Latin America, Good Luck Jonathan tried to do several other things right out of the Latin American playbook. He tried to delay elections when civil society rose up to say, no, you have to hold the elections. He tried to delay the transition. And, eventually, something happened in Nigeria. For the first time in Nigerian history, they had a free, fair, transparent election, mostly, in which power passed from one political party to another. Good Luck Jonathan was out. Muhammadu Buhari was in. But that didn't solve the problem. Nigeria continued to have high levels of corruption. The 10 million kids in Nigeria remain out of school. Only 1/4 of kids who go to elementary school go on to high school. Only 1/4 of children are fully immunized. 1/3 of all deaths from malaria in Africa are only in Nigeria. 70 million people lack clean drinking water. Only 2% of Nigerians have running water. To visualize what corruption looks like, they've paid for 12,000 megawatts of installed capacity, but because of horrible administration and corruption, they only actually have generation from 3,800 megawatts. So about 1/4 of what they should have. When I was there, we waited in gas lines to fill our cars for hours. And this is in a country that's supposed to export oil. They've got massive refineries, but the refineries don't do much because the money for spare parts and maintenance has been stolen. And so they were actually exporting oil to have it refined and then had to re-import oil for themselves. This produced the largest IDP, internally displaced person crisis in the world at that time, of 2.3 million persons. So all of this is really to underscore that corruption made Boko Haram. It's the human rights abuses that sustain it. People are detained without due process. The whole thing actually started, going back historically, with Mohammed Yusuf, who was really the intellectual author of Boko Haram, was a peaceful guy and was detained, in some ways. He wasn't advocating for violence. And then he was detained and killed by authorities. Fast forward to 6 months or just 2 years ago, in October 2020, there were large protests because of corruption, police brutality, against the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, the so-called SARS. And many of you on social media may have seen hashtag #EndSARS. And in the ensuing protest, police injured 48. They killed 9. 4 are missing, presumed dead. 21 others had gunshot wounds. And this all came out in a report which almost 6 months ago to today came out. And to this date, nothing has happened. So you see the impunity, the corruption, human rights abuse are continuing. And that really gives birth to violent extremism in northeastern Ghana. With that, I'm going to stop and give time to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to ask you some questions up Boko Haram later on, but I'm going to ask, I'm going to introduce now our friend Renee Doblik. Renee is an attorney experienced and senior executive with a background in the corporate sector and global nonprofits. She has been working in the areas of policy, technology, and the law. She began her career working with Fortune 500 companies in the technology and financial sectors. Her legal practice has expanded into digital tech law, including artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. She has worked in Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. And she serves as a member of the American Bar Association's representatives and observers to the United Nations. She's also the Rule of Law Officer for the ABA International Law Section, and she's a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and prior editor-in-chief of International Law News, which is published by the ABA International Law Section. Renee earned her Juris Doctor degree with honors and an award from Georgetown University Law Center, a Master of Science degree from Michigan State University, and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. So Renee, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pedro. And thank you to today's sponsors for the invitation to speak today as part of this second annual Rule of Law Webathon. It is an honor to be speaking on today's panel on rule of law threats from radicalization and violent extremism, sponsored by the American Bar Association International Law Section. A special thank you to the co-chairs of this panel, ABA International Law Section Chair-elect Marcos Rios in Chile, and Santiago Concha, a partner at CNR Law in Colombia, for organizing this important discussion on approaches to prevent and combat violent extremism. While I am the Rule of Law Officer for the ABA section of International Law and a member of the ABA representatives and observers to the United Nations, my remarks today are my own professional views and do not represent the views of the association. Nearly 85% of the world's population, or 6.5 billion people, last year lived in countries where the rule of law declined, according to the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. It marked the 4th year of the deterioration of the rule of law, spreading worldwide in every major region and the majority of countries. Their Rule of Law Index is a leading, data-driven ranking of countries with insights on 8 factors: government powers, corruption, open government, human rights and fundamental rights, public order and security, enforcement, and civil and criminal justice. I encourage you to explore the full report and the regional summaries. They provide online interactive data by country where you can deep dive into the details and also visually compare trends over time. The COVID-19 pandemic has added to the complex drivers, furthering the deterioration of the rule of law globally. The pandemic has also created significant setbacks and new barriers to making progress on achieving the international community's global UN Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs, and the 2030 Agenda. These goals advance peaceful options to address extreme poverty, food insecurity, inequities, justice gaps, corruption, human trafficking, conflicts and their drivers, and inclusive approaches for political, economic, and social engagement. The goals call for building accountable institutions and inclusive, peaceful societies grounded in respect for human rights and the rule of law. These 17 goals encompass policies and activities that further positive economic, social, political, and environmental conditions and the resilience of communities. These broader goals are valuable parts of broader strategic approaches for preventing and combating conflicts, instability, and the enabling environments for violent extremism. Similar to the UN Charter, human rights and the rule of law are at the core of these 17 goals of the SDGs. Human rights and the rule of law, similarly, are essential cornerstones for effective responses to address violent extremism and the broader enabling conditions that lead to radicalization and the destabilization of societies. The widespread deterioration of rule of law conditions and impingements on human rights have also been met with strong voices of people uniting in social movements, from the local to the global levels, as small as a few and as large as billions. They are connecting online and offline in support of human rights, peace, justice, the environment, ending discrimination and inequalities. They are turning to social movements to protect against abuses of power and corruption. Online hashtag movements, social media, videos, mobile apps, and online crowdsourced fundraising have emerged as standard practices. Hashtag campaigns like Black Lives Matter and Climate Action Now have demonstrated the power of individual and collective action, combining online and offline and spreading advocacy messages far and wide. As Steve Hendricks just discussed, in Nigeria, we've also seen those movements fight back against violent extremists. We saw the campaign, hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, in response to the outrageous abduction of 276 schoolgirls by the Boko Haram in Nigeria. Another global campaign is the Keep It On campaign. It's being used by advocates to push back against government shutdowns of the internet aimed at squelching unrest, speech, freedom of assembly, and independent media. It is civil society's way to say hashtag Keep It On. Yet bad actors and violent extremists are also turning to the internet and to other technologies to capitalize on the digital power to strengthen their recruitment and radicalization of others, their operations, contributions in financing, and violent activities. Leveraging digital tech, violent extremism continues to expand in reach geographically and online, in influence and in scale. During the pandemic, violent extremists have been expanding online recruitment strategies and propaganda, exploiting stay-at-home mandates and the acceleration of digital ubiquity. Online disinformation, misinformation, and extremist propaganda campaigns are increasingly sophisticated, scalable, and targeted. They are not afraid to innovate in their uses of social media, automated bots, and other tools. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, and virtual currencies operating beyond traditional financial systems. In short, violent extremism is growing transnationally and thriving not only in conditions of prolonged conflicts, human rights violations, lack of rule of law, weak institutions, which includes weak justice systems, and marginalization of certain populations from economic, social, and political participation. But also, violent extremism is thriving in our digital spaces, pushing public and private sectors to deal with their emergent threats. Last June, UN member states conducted a review of progress of international cooperation to prevent and combat terrorism, including preventing and addressing threats of violent extremism. UN member states concurred in the essential importance of developing an accurate understanding of how terrorists and violent extremists are misusing the internet and other technologies for incitement, propaganda, crowdfunding of unlawful activities, the spread of extremism content, and recruitment. UN member states described how there is, and I quote, an urgent need for the international community to globally counter such activities, and that these activities must be in compliance with international law, particularly international human rights law and the rule of law as fundamental bases for fighting terrorism and extremism. To give you an idea of multilateral cooperation to pragmatically combat this increased threat, Europol last May held its first referral action day specific to right-wing terrorists and extremists, coordinating with 28 international partners, including the New York City Police Department. That action day, that single day, led to having nearly 2,000 URLs on 180 platforms and websites, their terrorist content referred to online service providers to be reviewed for breach of the terms and conditions of the online service provider. They conducted another referral day this February, targeting online manuals used by extremist groups. And they referred 563 pieces of content, again, to the online service providers for review for breach of their terms and conditions. These referral action days are part of a series of similar actions to improve identification, enforcement, and deterrence, and to improve information sharing and coordination and action across the public and private sectors. These referral action days and takedown of content are in addition to the millions of items of content proactively or responsibly removed by online service providers. These efforts demonstrate emergent challenges and the difficulties of dealing with the duality of how technologies can be used to empower the enjoyment of our rights, including our freedom of thought and expression and the right to assembly, but also how these dual technologies and these challenges can be areas for misuse by bad actors to obstruct rights, to destabilize and further violent extremism. How can we best prevent, disrupt, and address the active digital and technology strategies emerging as part of violent extremism? Can we disrupt their aims in the digital space and then also disrupt their activities in physical spaces? UN member states have made clear that measures to address violent extremism need to comply with international law, particularly international human rights law and international humanitarian law. These legal frameworks protect and promote human rights and the rule of law. Human rights and the rule of law are complementary and mutually reinforcing. These principles are emphasized in the 2012 Declaration on the Rule of Law adopted by the UN General Assembly, which the American Bar Association participated in its adoption through its activities as an accredited NGO at the UN. And the UN member states also, again this past June, reaffirmed that rule of law and human rights are essential, complementary, and reinforcing during the second counterterrorism week at the UN, and then last September during the high-level general debate of the UN General Assembly. Several international and regional initiatives are bringing together multiple stakeholders, international and regional organizations, domestic authorities, tech companies, businesses, civil society organizations, and others to build resilience and to explore adopting new ethical guidelines, legal frameworks, policies, and other measures. There are initiatives specific to combating violent extremism at the UN. There are multilateral initiatives such as the Global Counterterrorism Forum with its Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. And there's multi-stakeholder initiatives such as ICT for Peace and an initiative, Tech Against Terrorism. We see how these efforts are part of an all of society approach that also are in support of the SDGs. And we see these issues arising in discussions in a range of other initiatives, such as during the adoption and the creation of the UN's first ever landmark ethical guidelines adopted in November through UNESCO for artificial intelligence. The legal community and bar associations have a valuable role to play in these ongoing and current multi-stakeholder discussions about guidelines and legal frameworks and measures that can uphold human rights, innovation, and the rule of law while combating violent extremism online and offline. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the remarks of the other speakers and your questions.
Thank you, Renee, so much. It's been quite interesting. I have some questions for you, but I'll keep them for later on. Our next panelist, to keep this moving, is my dear friend, classmate, and also partner at Lega. His name is Gabriel Calleja, and he's an expert in labor law, and everything that has to do with arbitration and resolution of conflicts and controversies. But he is better known in the human rights world as an alternate justice of the Venezuelan Supreme Court, who has been living in exile for the past 5 years. He graduated from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, same year as me, and also he's been working from exile in his capacity as senior partner for the firm. And Gabriel is going to be speaking to us in Spanish. He will, and I will be doing the simultaneous translation. He'll speak for a bit, and then I'll translate to all of you. So, Gabriel, welcome. Can you turn your camera on?
Muchas gracias, Pedro. Muchas gracias a todos los distinguidos expositores y muchas gracias a la American Bar Association y su sponsor por haberme extendido esta gentil invitación.
So he's saying thank you so much to the American Bar Association and all of the sponsors for inviting me to participate in this panel.
Quiero compartir con ustedes, primero, mi experiencia como venezolano, segundo, como abogado en el libre ejercicio de la profesión con más de 25 años de experiencia en la defensa de los derechos e intereses de empresas del sector privado, y tercero, como víctima de persecución política y violación de derechos humanos, luego de haber sido designado como magistrado suplente del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia por el Congreso de mayoría opositora para el periodo 2015-2021 y encontrarme obligadamente en el exilio en los Estados Unidos desde hace 5 años.
So Gabriel is sharing his experience, first as a Venezuelan, second as a labor lawyer, who for the past 25 years has been defending the rights and interests of the private sector. And third, as a victim of political persecution and violation of human rights after being appointed an alternate justice of the Venezuelan Supreme Court of Justice by the opposition majority Congress for the period 2015-2021. Gabriel has been living in exile, as I mentioned, for the past 5 years.
Como es del conocimiento de todos, Venezuela en las 2 últimas décadas ha estado gobernada por una ideología de izquierda que llegó a proponer al mundo la idea de un socialismo del siglo XXI.
He's mentioning that Venezuela has been experimenting for the past 2 decades with extreme left ideology called the 21st century socialism.
Con la convocatoria de una asamblea constituyente y posterior aprobación de la Constitución en el año 1999, comenzó el desmontaje del Estado de Derecho y, a su vez, la destrucción de la institucionalidad democrática en Venezuela.
He mentions that the dismantling of the rule of law in Venezuela began with the convening of a national constituent assembly and the subsequent approval of a new constitution in 1999.
Desde que Hugo Chávez asumió el poder, se generó una fuerte polarización política entre el gobierno y oposición, con una marcada tendencia a la intolerancia por parte del gobierno a la pluralidad de las ideas, a la acción política y un contundente rechazo a cualquier iniciativa contraria al gobierno.
He's saying that during these years, there has been a very strong polarization between the government and the opposition, which has resulted in government intolerance for any sort of dissent, political action, and or any initiative that which is perceived as contrary to the government.
Esta fuerte polarización llevó a la oposición política a negarse a participar en algunos procesos de elecciones parlamentarias, elecciones estadales, municipales, lo cual trajo como consecuencia un dominio total y absoluto por parte del partido de gobierno oficialista en todos los cargos de elección popular en la mayoría de estos años.
He's saying that polarization led to the opposition's refusal to participate in many of the electoral processes that we've had in the past 2 decades. And that resulted in absolute power on the hands of the ruling party.
Por otra parte, algunos representantes del sector empresarial asumieron el rol de actores políticos aliados a la oposición, participando en el paro cívico petrolero y además ejecutaron acciones u otras acciones de paralización patronal en contra del gobierno.
Because also of the polarization, several actors from the private sector decided to boycott the government and participated in the work stoppages of the past, which paralyzed the oil industry in Venezuela.
De esta manera comenzó progresivamente a consolidarse un rechazo contundente a la disidencia por parte del gobierno y una progresiva intromisión del poder ejecutivo en los otros poderes públicos. Esto trajo como consecuencia lo que hoy vivimos, que es una ausencia de separación de los poderes públicos, que ha estado marcado por algunos de los siguientes hechos que menciono a continuación.
This whole situation began or resulted also in the interference of the executive branch in other branches of the political powers. So basically what Venezuela has been living right now is with an absence of the separation of public powers. And that can be shown by the following facts.
Ausencia de transparencia e igualdad en los procesos electorales en los que se ha denunciado ventajismo y control de los procesos electorales por parte del gobierno.
Lack of transparency, equality in the electoral processes in which it has been denounced. Advantageousness and control of the electoral processes of the governing party.
Designación por parte de la mayoría oficialista de los magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia, Contralor General, Fiscal General, Defensor del Pueblo, todos con una clara inclinación política hacia el partido de gobierno.
The appointment of pro-government justices of the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the Comptroller, the Ombudsman, and all of them clearly with an inclination towards the ruling party.
Promulgación de leyes confiscatorias a la propiedad, a la libre iniciativa privada y libre comercio, restricciones a la libre convertibilidad de la moneda, controles de costos, de precios, restricciones a la inversión extranjera, nacionalizaciones, despojo de la propiedad privada, inamovilidad laboral absoluta, criminalización de la disidencia por protestas, restricciones a la libertad de expresión, a la libertad de circulación, entre otros.
Also, the enactment of laws which seem confiscatory to property, to free private initiative, to free trade, restrictions on the free convertibility of currency, cost controls, price controls, restrictions on foreign investment, nationalizations, expropriations, absolute labor immobility, the criminalization of dissent and protest, restrictions and freedom of expression, on freedom of movement, among others.
Promulgación de leyes habilitantes en materias reservadas a la reserva legal para despojar a la Asamblea Nacional, que fue electa en el 2015 y 2021, liderada por la oposición en su momento, de la facultad de dictar leyes, acuerdos y decisiones.
The enactment of enabling laws, which basically stripped the Venezuelan Congress or National Assembly of 2015-2021 from ruling on matters of legal reserve. Basically, they stripped the National Assembly from the power to dictate laws, agreements, and decisions.
Incremento del número de magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia de 20 a 32 para incorporar magistrados con afinidad a los intereses del gobierno, suspender los procesos de concurso de oposición de los jueces, designar jueces provisorios, destituir, arrestar y perseguir a los jueces que no acataran las directrices del gobierno.
The number of Supreme Court justices was increased from 20 to 32 through a reform of the judiciary in order to include people with interests related to the government, also to suspend the competition processes among judges, to appoint provisional judges, to dismiss, arrest, and to persecute judges who did not comply with government guidelines.
Apertura de procesos penales por parte de la Fiscalía contra la dirigencia política, persecución política, detenciones arbitrarias, ejecuciones extrajudiciales contra dirigentes políticos, sociales, gremiales, estudiantiles y empresariales por sus declaraciones públicas, participación en las protestas y cualquier otro tipo de acción cívica.
Also the opening of criminal proceedings by the prosecutor's office against the opposition's political leadership. He's also mentioning political persecution, arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial executions against political, social, union, student, and business leaders for their public statements, participation in protests, and for any other type of civic action.
Enjuiciamientos de civiles ante los tribunales militares por el delito de traición a la patria por la sola disidencia al gobierno.
The prosecution of civilians before military courts for the crime of treason, simply by the sin of dissent.
Invasión de competencias por parte del Poder Judicial para anular, desconocer las leyes promulgadas, los acuerdos y las decisiones dictadas por la Asamblea Nacional del periodo 2015 a 2021 con mayoría opositora, despojándolos de la inmunidad parlamentaria a sus diputados, suplir su labor legislativa y recibir la memoria y cuenta del presidente de la República.
Also, the invasion of powers by the judiciary to annul and ignore the laws enacted, agreements and decisions issued by the National Assembly of 2015-2021, which had an opposition majority, by stripping the National Assembly's deputies from parliamentary immunity, by replacing their legislative work, and by releasing the president from having to issue his State of the Union before the National Assembly.
Inhabilitación política de dirigentes de la oposición por parte de la Contraloría General de la República sin ningún procedimiento administrativo previo y mucho menos un procedimiento judicial.
The political disqualification of political leaders of the opposition by the office of the Comptroller General of the Republic without any prior administrative or judicial procedure.
Inacción del defensor del pueblo en la protección de las víctimas de violaciones de sus derechos constitucionales y legales.
The inaction of the Ombudsman in the protection of victims of violations of their constitutional and legal rights.
Acciones de discriminación por parte del gobierno mediante la exclusión de los programas sociales de aquellos civiles o ciudadanos no afectos al gobierno.
Discrimination by the government via the exclusion from social and civil programs for those citizens who are not who do not sympathize with the government.
El gobierno de Venezuela llegó hasta denunciar la Carta de la OEA y la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos con la finalidad de sustraerse de las obligaciones internacionales de protección de los derechos humanos.
Also, the government denounced the OAS Charter and the American Convention on Rights with the aim of derogating or being excluded from its international obligations to protect human rights.
Desacato a los mandatos y recomendaciones de los informes de los órganos de protección universal e interamericano de los derechos humanos, así como también las sentencias de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos.
The government has been in contempt of the mandates and the recommendations and reports of the Universal and Inter-American Human Rights Protection Bodies, as well as the judgments of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights.
Y entre muchas otras, incumplimiento por parte del Estado de las obligaciones impuestas en las decisiones de los laudios arbitrales internacionales.
And also, or finally, the failure of the states to comply with the obligations imposed by the decisions of international arbitral awards.
En todo este contexto, los órganos internacionales, convencionales y no convencionales de protección de los derechos humanos, las organizaciones gubernamentales y no gubernamentales de defensa de los derechos humanos, los estados, los gobiernos, los parlamentos, entre otros, han realizado grandes esfuerzos para lograr a través de sus denuncias, informes, declaraciones, sanciones, entre otros, para que se respeten, se defiendan y garanticen los derechos civiles y políticos, así como también los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales y ahora ambientales de todos los venezolanos.
In this context, the conventional and non-conventional international bodies for the protection of human rights, governmental and non-governmental organizations for the defense of human rights, states, governments, parliaments, among others, have made great efforts to achieve, through their denunciations, reports, declarations, sanctions, among others, that civil and political rights are respected, defended, and guaranteed, as well as the economic, social, cultural, and now the environmental rights of all Venezuelans.
Todos estos esfuerzos, si bien no han logrado cambiar la realidad política imperante en Venezuela y mucho menos han logrado la salida del gobierno de Nicolás Maduro, se han contribuido a, primero, concientizar al pueblo de Venezuela que es necesario promover algunos cambios desde adentro, aún en medio de la adversidad. Y segundo, presionar a los órganos del poder público para que se efectúen algunos ligeros cambios en algunas políticas mediante la promulgación de leyes y en algunas iniciativas de diálogo entre el gobierno y la oposición que están orientados a lograr algunos de los objetivos que señalaré más adelante.
Gabriel is saying that all of these efforts, although they have not accomplished the change or a change in the prevailing political reality of Venezuela, nor have they achieved the exit of the Nicolás Maduro government. They have contributed to two things, namely raising the awareness among the people of Venezuela that it is necessary to promote some type of change from within, even in the midst of adversity. And second, that this has brought pressure on the different entities of holding public power in Venezuela to make some slight changes in some policies and the enactment of certain laws and initiatives promoting dialogue between the government and the opposition. And those are aimed at the following.
Estos ligeros cambios hoy, al día de hoy, se están viendo en la apertura, la libre convertibilidad de la moneda y la despenalización de la dolarización, la despenalización de la iniciativa privada, la devolución de las propiedades y empresas expropiadas, la disminución del éxodo de personas venezolanas que migran al exterior, la disminución en un 50% de los índices de inseguridad, la liberación de algunos presos políticos, la recepción de ayuda humanitaria para los más necesitados, algunos planes de repatriación de venezolanos en el exterior, la reapertura de relaciones consulares con algunos países, la participación del sector privado en el diálogo social tripartito con presencia de la OIT, la instalación de una oficina de la Corte Penal Internacional en Venezuela, los intereses de capitales extranjeros que están yendo al país a invertir especialmente en la industria petrolera, las expectativas del incremento en las inversiones y del Producto Interno Bruto, que según estimaciones de la CEPAL puede ser un 5% este 2022, el mayor de Latinoamérica, y el pronóstico de un crecimiento económico que según el Credit Bank Suisse puede estar en el orden del 20% para Venezuela.
Okay, what Gabriel is saying that some of the changes, so going back, even though there has been no political change, what has been is some change in what the leadership is doing. And you can see in Venezuela right now that there's an opening to the free convertibility of the currency. And it is now legal to use the US dollar or any other foreign currency in business transactions. Private initiative is no longer a criminal endeavor. The government is returning properties and companies which were expropriated. There is a decrease in the exodus of people that we had before. There's also a decrease of 50% in the insecurity rates, in the personal security rates. Several political prisoners have been released. Humanitarian aid for those in need has been now allowed by the Venezuelan government. There are many repatriation plans for Venezuelans abroad. Many Venezuelans are returning to their country. There's the reopening of consular relations with other countries. Now there's also the participation of the private sector in social dialogues with the presidents of the ILO. Also, there is an installation. There was the installation of an office of the International Criminal Court in Venezuela. Also, foreign capital has shown an interest in investing in the country, especially in the oil and gas industry. There has been an increase in investments and also in GDP. There's an estimate that Venezuela's growth in GDP will be 5%, which is the largest in Latin America for 2022. And even Credit Suisse has forecasted that the growth is going to be of 20%.
Finalmente quiero expresar que si bien es cierto, estas no son señales de la recuperación del Estado de Derecho en Venezuela, sí pueden ser señales de un cambio de rumbo que puede acompañar otros cambios. Desde mi perspectiva de exilado y perseguido político, puedo decir que las reformas parten de una realidad social cambiante a cuyas circunstancias debemos irnos adaptando, no para conformarnos o resignarnos, sino para buscar otras alternativas que nos permitan seguir luchando para recuperar la institucionalidad en nuestro país.
Okay, so finally, Gabriel is saying that he doesn't want to express that what he mentioned before are not signs of the recovery of the rule of law in Venezuela, but they can be interpreted as signs that there's a change of course, and that change of course may derive in other changes. From his perspective, as a person in exile, as a person who has been persecuted politically, what he can say is that the reforms are derived from a changing social reality, and the entire country is adapting to those circumstances, not because people are being resigned, but because people are looking for other alternatives that will allow us to continue to recover or to continue the process of fighting to recover the institutions in Venezuela.
Muchas gracias por su atención y quedo a su disposición para responder cualquier pregunta.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel. So we'll also have some questions for Gabriel later on. If you can give me 1 second, please. Okay, our next speaker. Our next speaker is Leila Mooney from the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. Leila is the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas, and she's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Given her outstanding career in service of promoting the rule of law and women's legal rights, the American Bar Association International Law Section has just selected her to be the recipient of the 2022 Mayor Rasmussen Award for the Advancement of Women in International Law. So Leila, the floor is yours. Welcome, and thank you so much for participating in our panel today.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And I also want to thank the program co-chairs and the chair-elect, Marco Rios, and also Rabbi David Schwartz, who is the vice chair of the section, and Christina Hyde, and everyone on this panel as well, for the opportunity to share some ideas around this issue, very relevant today. And in so doing, I would like to sort of connect my brief remarks. I promise I won't take much time because I think there's a lot of opportunity for engagement and discussion. On the initial remarks posed by Steve Hendricks on the impacts of violent conflict, extremism, radicalization, and I will try to bring in a big integration of why do we need to have a gender lens into this discussion. Everything that has been said so far is so relevant for different parts of the world and the discussions and the threats to governance and the rule of law. And one very important item, if you will, that cannot go unnoticed, although many times it does go unnoticed, is this conversation on the gender disparities. In general terms, and at the same time, it does not go unnoticed in this conversation of violent conflict and extremism. It's important to acknowledge this. There are different impacts on men and women, and understanding those distinctive effects is critical for designing effective peace-building approaches, and ensuring that there is a greater gender equality and protection for women and girls. In the context of war, in the context of violent conflict, there is a lot of data around the world, recent, new, but also from the past, where we've seen and we continue experiencing that women are affected negatively and are used as a weapon of war. And this is a fact. It's not a parallel reality. It happens. There's not enough data to back this argument. So the use of gender-based violence against women and girls in situations of conflict has been on the rise. And at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that also over the past 2 decades, we could say, there have been rising efforts in the international community, organizations, within the US government, different administrations have increasingly, all of them, recognized the importance of gender equality in creating enduring and peaceful societies. I know for a fact that Steve Hendricks, during his tenure with USAID in different parts of our world, has supported and worked on these initiatives. So looking at this issue in the larger context of and frameworks of realizing and enforcing universal rights, the International Covenant of Human Rights is central to this discussion. We cannot be neutral. And that is something that I thought it would be very important to bring to this conversation today. In particular, I think it's also important to acknowledge that in the field of countering violence, violent extremism in particular, approaching different strategies to combat radicalization and coming up with different strategies, these disparities, these different dimensions on how women and gender are impacted are also led and we have to acknowledge that the different roles that both men and women can play in this context. And in saying this, it's always important to acknowledge a professor of mine when I was studying in England many months ago. He used to say, there's no text without context, right? No text without context. So for us lawyers, human rights lawyers, practitioners, rule of law practitioners, those of us committed to certain principles and values to uphold the international framework of human rights, it's so relevant to be able to integrate this gender dimension into this discussion, particularly when designing strategies and policies from all levels of the international community, technical assistance, foreign aid, and understanding what's happening with that particular context and what are the drivers for violence, for extremism, where are those breakdowns, and who are the players, and how all these different gender dynamics come into play. It is certainly countering violent extremism, or also called CVE, in the field of those who are experts on this. They acknowledge that this is an understudied, but also very important critical security issue, in the 21st century. It's important to acknowledge in this discussion, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and all the 6 resolutions that follow, on women, peace, and security, and all of this framework, and understanding what are the different dimensions and impacts, and who are the players, in this field, and how can we best address and create conditions, for enabling the reestablishment, or the creation or the development of different frameworks for a rule of law to develop and emerge. They do certainly need to have that perspective, that framework, and that integration. In particular, I think, and I know we are short on time. Of course, I can go forever on these issues, but I think when we speak of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, it's important to acknowledge that it has been a central element as well of how the design of policies and strategies when it comes to promoting the rule of law in violent conflicts, reestablishing peace, some level of order, and working with different sectors that have been radicalized. It has been central to the importance of addressing the impact of war and on men and women, and the importance of generating this leveling the playing field. But also understanding that women and men can also be drivers of radicalization. So again, this is the sort of bringing in the element of there's no text without context. And then when I understand the context, okay, so how do we look at the different impacts and the drivers? And what are the strategies that we're going to be developing? What are the frameworks for integration and the integration of a strategy that will create some new frameworks? I said on the panel before that I'm an optimistic by nature. No? So how do we use these international frameworks, be it hard law, international hard law, or soft law, and the international human rights framework to enable change? No? Now, when we talked about this resolution, I think it's important also to acknowledge the different opportunities that brings. No? And again, we go back to, do we think only, okay, what are the negative impacts? How are women and girls affected by radicalized groups? Yes, it's very important. It's fundamental to be able to integrate this vision. And then also, what are we going to do, no, as an international community and through partnerships and institutions where we can really invest in enabling different opportunities to emerge through research, through policy, and through practice. So I will stop there. There are other elements we can bring into the discussion, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Leila. This is quite interesting. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about Afghanistan. There's so many bad examples around the world these days. That's terrible. But we'll continue this conversation. Let me introduce now our final speaker for today, and hopefully you're still happy to be with us, at least as you've been waiting. So, but we're looking forward to hearing from you. Elisa Massimino. She directs the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown University Law Center, where she is visiting professor of law. She also serves as a senior fellow in national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress. She spent her 27 years in the past decade as president and CEO at Human Rights First, one of the nation's leading human rights advocacy organizations. She's been around in everything that has to do with human rights. Elisa holds a law degree from the University of Michigan, a master's in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University, and she's Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Trinity University, where she was recognized with the Distinguished Alumni Award. So Elisa, the floor is yours. Please enlighten us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be speaking with such distinguished panelists, including my office neighbor, Lelia Mooney. It's always a joy when you can be on a panel and actually learn something while you're from your fellow panelists. So that is really a wonderful pleasure to be here and to hear from all of you. I'm batting cleanup here, so my job is to try to weave some of this together a little bit, and I'll do that in maybe about 5 to 8 minutes. And maybe just to underscore a few of the points that have been made. Renee spoke already about the decline in the rule of law. The World Justice Project, which is an excellent methodology for looking at the state of the rule of law around the world, and it's not good. And just about every organization that looks at and ranks and evaluates the state of democracy and the rule of law, including the VDEM Institute out of Sweden, which underscores that that these are not problems that the West is immune from. In North America, they say, and Eastern and Western Europe, no country has advanced in democracy over the last decade. So no matter where you look, the red lights are flashing. And I think that's perhaps one of the, I mean, here where I work in Washington, D.C., that we saw that up close and personal, where political polarization really turned the corner into violent extremism when we saw an attempted coup just steps from Georgetown Law School, where Lily and I work. And, you know, I think that's probably one of the reasons why President Biden announced very early on that he wanted to have a summit for democracy, and talked a lot about democracies that deliver. And what that meant, I think, is democracies that deliver on human rights, on basic needs. And we heard from Stephen just how clear the connection can be between the failure of governments to provide for the basic needs of their people, the fundamentals of human dignity, food and shelter, and the draw towards radicalism and extremism. You know, these are not isolated phenomenons. They're part of a vicious cycle. And I guess that's the piece of that I want to underscore. Really is the relationship between poverty and the rule of law and extremism. Again, Renee spoke about the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, there's probably no other social phenomenon that's more comprehensive in its assault on human rights than poverty. Because poverty undermines the universal rights to health, to housing, to food and water and education, but it also undermines the exercise of civil and political rights, like the right to political participation, the right to a fair trial, personal security, some of the most fundamental human rights. According to the UN Development Program's Human Development Report from a couple of years ago, more than 1.3 billion people around the world are living in what's called multidimensional poverty, which is a measure of poverty that looks beyond the daily income measure to, you know, incorporate the interlocking deprivations of the poor. Here in the United States, 2020 marked the first increase in poverty after 5 years of decrease, bringing the total number of people living in poverty in the United States to 37.2 million. And then you add into that the pandemic with its outsized impact on the poor and marginalized, and as Lelia pointed out, also the enormous setback that the pandemic has posed for the rights of women, many of whom have really been on the front lines of dealing with the fallout from the pandemic, really risks making this reversal a trend, not only in the United States, but around the world. And again, that you know, those numbers and statistics around poverty are, of course, frightening in and of themselves. But when you understand fully the relationship between the deprivation of fundamental human rights, like the right to food and housing and water, to the rise of political polarization, extremism, and even violent extremism, we know that we have to take note. So it's no surprise, given the relationship between human dignity and security, that the Sustainable Development Goals list the eradication of poverty by 2030 as job number one. But that's not, you know, that understanding's not a new thing. That the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted in the wake of the most horrific violent extremism that the world has ever seen, recognized in Article 25 that everybody has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And I think now during the pandemic, we're seeing perhaps a renewed understanding of the relationship between respect for economic and social rights and economic development, the rule of law, and extremism and radicalization. So I would say that as lawyers, we have to work together with civil society groups, with governments and human rights movements to operationalize this imperative to lift the burden of poverty. We need new strategies to prevent the magnifying effect of the pandemic on poverty, and to address, as Lelia said, the gender and racial dynamics of poverty, and to see that, perhaps in the wake of, in a previous era where we were looking post the 9/11 attacks and the rise of Al-Qaeda, where we were looking at extremism through that lens of national security, we now need to be looking much more holistically at this as a human security issue, very much related to the respect for human rights, that, again, the essential wisdom that the world arrived at in the wake of the worst catastrophe that we saw in World War II is more and more resonant today. So I think I'll stop there and we can jump into our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elisa. That's really interesting, especially when you live in a poor country like mine, which is rich with oil, but a ton of social problems. And I can perfectly relate to everything that each one of you has been talking about today. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to start thinking about a question that each one of you wants to ask someone else within the panel. Because I haven't been seeing that many questions coming in through the chat function. And I invite once again anyone listening to us from around the world to use the chat function at this time and to send us your questions. So first of all, I'm going to start with Stephen. And I'm curious, Stephen, why would people in this day and age, it's surprising to me, it's 2022, why do people join groups like Boko Haram, and is there something that the international community can do in general, it still is very surprising to me.
Yeah, I think, Lisa mentioned some of the drivers of conflict, and Lelia mentioned some of the gender lenses that we can look at. If you look at the Boko Haram combatants who were captured during this conflict, and also the ones that defected, they have a very small number of things in common, all of them. Everyone speaks Kanuri. Okay. Almost all of them are illiterate. Almost all of them were unemployed. Almost all of them really had no hope of doing anything. They're not all Muslims. There are some Christians, but you got to just stop thinking about this in religious terms, and you start thinking about it in economic or political terms. You can predict what's going to happen. This is no more about religious fanaticism than the wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, or Colombia were about being really good Catholics. If you started thinking about Catholicism or Christianity, you would never understand the civil war in Guatemala. Similarly, if you start thinking about Islam, you're not going to understand Nigeria or Iraq for that matter. what we need to do is address the drivers. If all of the recruits are illiterate, let's let them read. I remember in Ghana when I was there, the Ghana Bar Association was organizing a seminar on how to vaccinate Ghana against violent extremism. And they were talking about all these legislative fixes. And I said, no, fix your school system. Let your kids learn how to read. Once they learn how to read, don't worry about it. I said they're never going to join Boko Haram anyway because they don't speak Kanuri. But they might join some other extremist group. But it's really the jobs and the incomes that were key. The flip side of this is actually good news. For those of us who know about gang violence in Guatemala or Salvador, it's the same drivers in Northeast Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon. They have to join. If you want drugs, we'll get you drugs. If you want tattoos, we'll get you tattoos. If you want adventure, you can blow some stuff up. You'll get some incomes. You don't have to worry about being unemployed. It's crimes of opportunity like Central American gangs. So just like we've done anti-gang interventions in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., where I am right now, that have been very successful. There is optimism in Central America, and there's optimism for Northeast Nigeria once you understand the drivers.
Wonderful. That's really interesting.
Sorry, Pedro. I'm tempted to jump in if I may quickly.
Wonderful. That's even better. We need. I'm sure our audience will appreciate this being very dynamic and having a conversation. Each one of you has given us great remarks. But you're the experts. I wanted to speak among yourselves. Ask questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm building on Steve's and Elisa's comments, addressing the drivers, understanding the context, well, like what this professor, used to tell me, tell us in class, is there's no text without context. So understanding that is so central, and so as we're trying to understand the context to address the root problems of the issue, I was reminded of a German philosopher / political scientist, Hannah Arendt, who she wrote that loneliness, individual loneliness, this sense of being excluded from the res publica, the vita activa, the active life, was one of the main drivers of totalitarianism, and radicalization, and that's what also Steve Hendricks is talking about, and also Elisa. I had the privilege several years ago, not that long ago, to actually conduct assessments in some parts of Latin America of the root causes of juvenile justice, which is a big topic as well in different parts of the world when we look at drivers of extremism and violence. And what were the rule of law needed responses to this problem, and actually looking at the entire chain, at the system, and interviewing former gang members. I had the privilege of interviewing former gang members, and the answers I received was this sense of loneliness, exclusion, not belonging, not being accepted by society. And then when they were joining the gang, they had this sense of brotherhood, protection. They had access to, of course, drugs, guns, action, girlfriends. You want this, you have it, Even though they knew that they were, by the age of 18 to 20, they were going to be dead. They told me that. We already knew that, but, we were so lonely. That was a word, so lonely. My parents died, all sorts of things. No access to education, lack of opportunity. So as Steve, this is a very clear example, no? A comparative example that I think it's important to bring to the table, and that it also applies to the reality we're living today in different parts of the world. I'll stop there because I can talk forever.
Quite interesting, and explains a lot of the roots of the problem. Renee, my friend, what are you doing for the Bar Association? What's the role of the Bar Associations in promoting the rule of law, specifically as addressed to radicalization and extremism? What is there something that can be done from your point of view?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because lawyers, bar associations, the broader legal community, and the clients and communities they serve are a key part of this. In that rule of law index, we saw that one of the most prominent trends in this past year was the closing space for civil society. And that closing space is infringing on fundamental rights, those rights to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy even. And these areas, you have your human rights defenders, your justice defenders, your environmental defenders, as was mentioned. Also embedded in there are women's rights and the rights of girls, the rights of marginalized communities. The legal community has a key role in helping the discussion that we are having right now as to how do you respect those rights under international law and uphold them. Those rights that are in international humanitarian law and international refugee law. At the same time that we then achieve our aims to combat extremism and acts of terrorism and the drivers behind them. What we are seeing in a disturbing trend is that some of the responses to countering terrorism are being used as pretext for squelching dissent, political opposition, speech, independent media, and to even intimidate lawyers and judges, witnesses, and justice staff. So the legal community has a key role in helping other stakeholders identify information, legal frameworks, empowering communities, and helping stitch together these different areas and across this whole of society approach. I'd be interested in hearing others' opinions as well, but I know perhaps time is short.
Pedro, if I may just sort of tee off from Renee's comment, you know, in the Nigeria case, when the central bank president presented that phone book size dossier of evidence about billions of dollars being stolen, you know, where was the Bar Association as he was being fired and removed? You know, and when the officers or the enlisted guys were detained their commander because they hadn't been paid and their supplies had been stolen, and they got the death penalty, you know, it's unfathomable. You know, and I think, you know, these kind of abuses of justice are how we end up with extreme situations. You know, going back under Jaime Lucinchi, I think it was in Venezuela, when they caught the presidency doing what they call round-tripping money, playing against different exchange rates and selling cars, buying them at one preferential rate and selling them at the market rate. And this was all found out. Who went to jail? Not President Lucinchi, even though it came from his office. It was the American citizen head of the Ford Motor in Caracas. That wasn't Hugo Chavez. That was Jaime Lucinchi. You know, and so you have a situation when an Hugo Chavez or a Daniel Ortega, they say, well, I'm coming in because systems are corrupt, and they're right, it was corrupt, but then they take it to a whole new level. As lawyers, we need to insist on the rule of law early on and every day before things get out of control.
Yeah, the sad thing is that countries don't learn from each other, and there's a movement around the region, at least in Latin America. And I want to ask Gabriel about that. I want to ask him regarding what can be perceived as the destruction of the rule of law in the continent or the subcontinent. Do you think that's a preconceived plan for the hemisphere, Gabriel? Let me switch to Spanish. Este tema de la destrucción del Estado de Derecho, ¿es una coincidencia o es un plan? ¿De dónde viene eso?
Sin duda alguna es un plan elaborado y diseñado desde hace muchos años, que se ha expandido por toda América y donde queda demostrado en los discursos políticos, en los anuncios en nuestros países de Latinoamérica de los candidatos que asumen el poder bajo esta ideología de realizar referéndum para lograr instalar asambleas constituyentes, para entregarle el poder al pueblo, para enunciar que la propiedad colectiva, el socialismo del siglo XXI, es decir, son los mismos discursos, los mismos modelos y los mismos procedimientos. Por eso es un plan preconcebido, no es un plan casual.
So Gabriel thinks it is a preconceived plan, he says that if you study the political speech of those who come to office in several of the countries in Latin America, and you look at the recipe where they start by promoting a referendum to obtain a national constitutional assembly to create a new constitution for those countries, where you start seeing talks about expropriation, about collective property. That sort of thing is being seen in different parts of Latin America. And at least on Gabriel's point of view, is part of a preconceived plan from the extreme left. Okay. And Gabriel, also with you, have you seen what has been the role of the international community in addressing these issues of rule of law in your experience? Gabriel, after leaving Venezuela, he studied an LLM at American University, and now he's also writing about human rights a lot. So, Gabriel, ¿qué has visto tú de la participación de las organizaciones internacionales en el problema específico de Venezuela?
En los últimos 20 años hay que distinguir tres momentos. Hay un primer momento desde que Chávez asume el poder, desde el año 1999 hasta el año 2010, donde la comunidad internacional se mantuvo indiferente a los problemas que ocurrían en Venezuela. Recordemos que Venezuela compraba la afinidad de los países a través de la entrega de petróleo por negociaciones de comida o sin pago alguno. Durante este periodo, la comunidad internacional fue indiferente con el tema de Venezuela, a pesar de que ya existían violaciones a los derechos humanos y se estaba desmontando el Estado de Derecho. Luego hay un segundo momento, después del año 2010, entre el 2013, 2014 y 2017, donde comienza la arremetida, ya estaba Maduro en el poder, muere Chávez, comienzan las persecuciones a la disidencia en las protestas. Y aquí, en el sistema interamericano, observamos una importante actuación a nivel de los órganos de la OEA y de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos para comenzar a imponer a Venezuela las obligaciones de respeto, las obligaciones de garantía de los derechos, no solo civiles y políticos, sino también de derechos sociales, económicos, sociales y culturales. Y hay un tercer momento en donde el sistema de protección universal de derechos humanos a través de la ONU comienza a actuar de manera más importante, y es donde vemos que las comisiones, y en este caso el alto comisionado de los derechos humanos, la alta comisionada de los derechos humanos, y en los últimos años la Corte Penal Internacional comienzan a actuar con mayor protagonismo en precisamente denunciar la situación de Venezuela e imponer al gobierno de Venezuela exigir el cumplimiento de esas obligaciones internacionales. Entonces aquí hay una evolución que hoy día se puede decir es bastante favorable, pero que tardó muchísimo en reaccionar la comunidad internacional. En resumen, podemos decir que apenas en los últimos 5 años es cuando observamos a la comunidad internacional en conjunto, en el sistema universal y en el sistema interamericano, reaccionar de manera contundente al problema de Venezuela.
Okay, so this is quite interesting. In the case of Venezuela, I asked Gabriel about the involvement of the international community in terms of how to respect the rule of law or to promote the respect of the rule of law in Venezuela. And he can point out to 3 different moments. The first moment when President Chavez came into power, and it's that first moment between 1999 and 2010. During that period of time, it coincided with very high oil prices. And the Venezuelan government used Venezuelan oil to buy friendships and votes in the international community, and many countries and many of the country representatives were very fond of Mr. Chavez and Venezuelan, cheap Venezuelan oil, or in some cases, free Venezuelan oil. So during that period, you can say that for the first 10 years or so, that the international community was really indifferent to what was going on in Venezuela in terms of the dismantling of the political institutions in Venezuela. The second period, and he says that begins between 2010 and 2017. It's the period that coincides with the death of Mr. Chavez and Mr. Maduro coming into office. Many things happen during that period. The Maduro regime starts to persecute people. And it's the first time that the OAS and the Inter-American Court for Human Rights begins paying attention to Venezuela and starts putting pressure on the Venezuelan government and starts calling the attention of the international community. And then there's a third moment after 2017. And he says that's the moment when the United Nations and the commissions regarding human rights and the ICJ really start paying attention to Venezuela and they become really active in studying the cases of human rights violations in Venezuela. So he sees this as an evolution, but the main point being that probably the intervention is welcome, but it's been too late. Too much time has passed, and a lot of these things could have been avoided if the international communities would have been a little more proactive in participating, at least in the Venezuelan situation. But again, the problems around the world are even more complex than the problems in Venezuela. So, okay, gracias, Gabriel. Let me talk to you about, you mentioned women, peace, and the security agenda. That sounds really interesting. What can be done, you know?
Well, I think, you know, it all starts with, you know, where we sit, you know, where we are, you know, and if we are sort of thinking about policy interventions and strategies, I always wonder, okay, so how are we going to implement this? No, because we are very good, you know, as Elisa mentioned, no, like never before, we have wonderful international human rights frameworks today. No, we have, you know, all sorts of frameworks that help us promote the rule of law and uphold human rights, and yet sort of the failures continue. No? So for policymakers, for NGO leaders, for international organizations, sort of integrating this gender lens into the strategies, I think is fundamental. And understanding context, I always keep getting back to this, no? Is central to the conversation, and how these different drivers we are discussing today play in the mix, no? And as a result, how we're going to work together, and how, you know, we lawyers, you know, we work on transactions, no? But all of this is also relational, no? So how do we map, you know, what's happening, and how do we develop strategies that can create conditions for these initiatives to develop? I think quickly, I also want to mention in the last minute, less than a minute, another driver that is very important, that is affecting all of us worldwide, is the lack of trust in institutions, public and private institutions. The Edelman Trust Barometer it gives us very interesting data, you know, also very relevant and linked to what the World Justice Project through the Rule of Law Index has been able to gather over the years. But the Trust Barometer it gives us very interesting data, particularly before and after the pandemic. You know, before the pandemic, there was a bigger trust in government institutions. After the pandemic, that trust has dramatically decreased. You know? And then you have different layers on how the impacts of media and institutions, the role of the private sector, and this rule of law based society, how is that functioning? So I think we also need to put that in the mix when we are sort of devising this type of thinking and initiatives. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Lily. Elisa, I want you to reflect on the future, if possible. Because we have a system that began after Second World War, and it definitely is not, even though we have great things as you've mentioned, how can we really fix things? Is it fixable? You know, one of the things that worries me is that the lack of leadership. The world was accustomed for the past 60 years to have solid leadership, democracy building, a democracy building machine from the United States. And January of 2020, 2021, pandemic really gets me, but I think that it was January 6th last year, right? That really concerned a ton of people around the world, especially in countries like my country, where we're hoping for leadership. What do you think?
Well, a couple of things very quickly, because I think we have just one more minute. One is that Lalia mentioned the lack of trust in institutions. I think that is wrapped up in the vicious cycle that I mentioned about institutions not delivering what they have promised. And that's part of what the, reinvigorating democratic institutions is about. At the same time, we have autocrats who are, promoting a lack of faith in institutions in order to say, as the former president of the United States said, only I can fix this, I alone. And that leads to then that institutions are irrelevant because we have a strongman leader and that's all that we need. And when institutions are not delivering, it makes that message more better received by people. And I completely agree that having standards and laws and all of that is necessary but not sufficient. My own view after 30 years of working as a human rights lawyer is that these standards are all terrific and we need to be shoring them up all the time and renewing them. But rights get negotiated and enforced or not enforced in a political environment. And as lawyers, we often shy away from that our role is, in the courtroom and with the treatise and all of that. And I think that for lawyers, it's time for us to, maybe take off the robes and get off the bench or wherever we are, the wigs, and get more engaged in electing better people, in making sure that we have people who are, you mentioned, Pedro, the lack of leadership. It doesn't come out of nowhere. We have to do a better job of pressing and organizing and delivering the leadership that we want, that we need. And that too is the role of lawyers. Renee mentioned a lot of the bright spots. This is happening. The SDGs, which is very much, even though it comes down from the UN and all of that, but it is very much a vehicle for grassroots mobilization around economic development and the protection of rights, around gender. And that's very exciting. I think that as much of the red lights that are flashing that we have been talking about, there is, I think, corresponding to that, a growing kind of new human rights movement of people who are ready to step into the, onto the field of battle around these issues and stand up for what we all believe in. So I take some comfort in that and encouragement from that.
Wonderful. Well, that's inspiring, and it gives us food for thought. I want to thank each one of you. You've been wonderful. This has been a very interesting panel. Thank you for having me. And not knowing much about this topic, I hope I have nothing else to say, but thank you, Renee. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Lilia. Thank you, Gabrielle and Stephen. And thank you to the American Bar Association and Section of International Law. To those of you who are still here, please continue on. The webathon will continue for one more day. It's 24 hours. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. I enjoyed it.
Yes, very much.
Thank you.
Lelia.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here.
So
Yeah,
I
I saw your text. I'm going to quote you now as well. Forget about my law professor.
you saw my email?
Yes. I'll call you.
Bye.
Because they're frozen out. They're unemployed. They're not married. Anyway. There's too much noise here. We'll talk later.
Let's talk.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
the rule of law works in our countries to assure that the maximum impact and assistance is made to economic and social development. We hope and trust that you will all participate. The 12 panels during the day will be very well thought out and carefully prepared, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you very much. uncomfortable about how the rule of law works in our countries to assure that the maximum impact and assistance is made to economic and social development. We hope and trust that you will all participate. The 12 panels during the day will be very well thought out and carefully prepared, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you very much.